Welcome everyone to MTG Rebellion's State of the Meta. I'm Darth Rictus of the Darkstream, and today we're going to walk through Week 9 of the standard metagame postbans.
I'm Max Damage. Comment below if you have any questions as we navigate through the changes. Now let's untap.
Well, this has been a week that shook up the meta in ways we didn't fully anticipate. Dimir Midrange rejoins the Tier 1 list alongside 5-color Domain at long last. Esper Control holds firm for the 5th week straight, and Selesnya Enchantress surprises us all by grinding its way to the top for the first time all season.
Wow, and in Tier 2, we see Orzhov Control holding firm along with Mono Red Aggro. 3 Tier 1 archetypes have fallen, however, and Esper Legends rose? Okay. Azorius Control, Azorius Soldiers, Mono Black Aggro all failed to put up any sort of impressive results over the weekend, sliding down from Tier 1. Remember, we keep an eye on results. We're results-oriented with these meta tier lists. These aren't just our opinions. So, very important note there. I always want to emphasize, and I just want to sneak that in there. I want to emphasize that about the show. But anyway, their pilots opted for other routes. It's essentially what happened. Those decks did not perform well. This makes a great deal of sense as Esper Control has outpaced Azorius Control for some time now. Dimir Midrange is a far easier tempo deck to build and tune than Azorius Soldiers is, while being far more versatile than the Mono Black counterpart.
And I mean, Azorius Control managed just a single 8th place finish in an MTGO challenge over the weekend. While it's certainly been tearing up the best of 1 cups that have been running around, that really hasn't translated into best of 3 play lately. And I suspect it'll fall into Tier 3 before much longer at this rate.
Yeah, essentially. Azorius Soldiers didn't top 8 any MTGO challenges, but did slot multiple top 8s in the APAC League, along with the top 8 in MTGO League. This deck continues to await a dedicated pilot to tune it up and take down another meaningful trophy.
Moving right along, we have Mono Red, which took 3rd in an MTGO challenge over the weekend, reminding us that it's still relevant while failing to complete its rampage. I mean, Red represents another archetype that feels slightly underpowered, but here's hoping the Wilds of Eldraine can lend a hand in bolstering that.
Right. I suspect that we've talked about recently how the most played colors are Esper. Red, of course, and green have both suffered from recent changes, bans, sets. So yeah, Wilds of Eldraine will hopefully alleviate some of that. Orzhov Control did take down NBL Swiss Best of 3 tournament over the weekend while placing another copy into the top 4, along with a 3rd place finish in the MTGO League. Not quite enough, though, to push it back into Tier 1, but a trophy this weekend would certainly place it back on top, I think. Keep an eye on Orzhov Control for this weekend. People will be trying out that list.
Next, we see the return of Esper Legends to the realm of Tier 2 on the back of a top 8 finish in this past Saturday's MTGO Challenge and a near miss for top 8 in Sunday's tourney by the same pilot, Musasabi. While I don't know how this deck pushes through the competition, frankly, I mean, it's still fighting to regain its previous reign at the top, and I got a lot of respect for that.
Yeah, me too. Last but not least, definitely not least, Mono Black Aggro has been the most prolific Tier 1 archetype outside of Esper Control. It did, however, only manage a single top 8 finish across all recorded tournaments and events this past weekend. Rictus, you want to tell us what the hell happened here?
I mean, well, I personally believe the Mono Black players were going to evolve away from Gix's Command and go for a sleeker build. Turns out they just added another color and some counterspells instead. So...
Okay. So are we going to say that Mono Black is drowning in a sea of Dimir at the moment, or what's going on?
I mean, I don't see it dying out. I think the archetype just needs to evolve. I think the sideboard guide we did shows a potential path as I was smashing through some Dimir midrange lists with it in that form. What you can't do is play 5-mana sorcery spells into a deck with counterspells. And I think Domain really taught us that lesson earlier this season. So for you Mono Black players out there, maybe take a hint. Gix's Command's not where you want to be right now. You got to go leaner.
Yeah, and you did call that. We had been seeing up till a couple weeks ago versions of the deck with Gix's Command in the main. People just praising the card, and it saw a lot of play. And yeah, I think you called that one. That would make the deck a little too heavy-handed over time. So fair points all around. Moving on, Tier 3 offers no surprises. For Blue Jin, Rakdos Midrange, White Weenie. We all knew these decks were doomed to the bottom of the pile, where they've been stuck really for weeks now. Now let's break down the tier 1 archetypes, starting with Esper Control. Rictus, are you ready to rock it?
Let's do it. Put a crown on Esper Control because 5 weeks straight is our tier 1 record post bans, and it shows no signs of slowing down. The fun police aren't changing much, but if it ain't broke, why fix it? The inclusion of Edgar, Charmed Groom, over here in the sideboard, and Invasion of Phyrexian highlight the latest tech, presumably to combat the non-exile based removal and desire to play armies in a can for the mid-range matchups and control mirrors. I mean, for instance, Lily of the Veil certainly cries when positioned against either, and Shieldred's Edict also doesn't love that. So this is just a solid diversification of threats in the name of a few extra margin points, and that's classically how archetypes develop in an established meta, which I think we have at this point. Esper Control took down an MTGO challenge over the weekend while placing copies into the top 8 of another, cementing its place at the top of the heap for the 5th week straight. And that's how it rolls with Esper Control. I think you're on mute, my friend.
Oh, I apologize. So I think this is maybe the second, perhaps third week in a row we've seen multiple archetypes using Siphon Insight. Talk to us about why that is still a main board choice. What is it aiming to grab from the other tier 1 decks, for example? And I see it's gone down to 3 copies. Is that pretty much the norm now?
Yeah, I think 3 Siphon Insight main, maybe 1 on the board, which we're seeing here, is pretty normal. And really what that signifies is that they expect control mirrors. Because Siphon Insight's not great if anybody's going to put serious pressure on you, but the moment the game slows down and it gets into a card advantage war, it'll just bury your opponent in card advantage. And that's a whole thing. So I expect to see Siphon Insight as long as Esper Control reigns supreme because they got to battle the mirror. And to a degree, it does pay dividends against decks like Domain, where they have some Atraxas at the top end that you can just steal sometimes. And it feels a little filthy when you get to play counterspells and Atraxa.
Yeah, rightfully so. That would feel a little bit dirty.
Right.
They're snatching a breach in the multiverse.
Oh, right.
Whew. All right. Now, talk to us about this next archetype. Is Siphon Insight in this one? Dimir Midrange. What's going on with this deck?
So, Max, over the last few weeks, we talked about Mono Black needing to evolve away from the heavy Gixis command builds, and it turns out some people were listening and pushed into blue instead, favoring Counterspells, Fairy Masterminds, and Urtire 2 and Kaido Shizuki. Dimir Aggro roared back into fucking relevance over the weekend, placing 3 copies into the top 8 of the first MTGO challenge while taking down the trophy in the process, then pushed another 3 copies into the top 8 of the second MTGO challenge over the weekend. If you broaden the picture just a little bit, it also placed another 9 copies into the top 16 across both tournaments. That is an absurd amount of Dimir Midrange. That, to me, shows an archetype that is just bursting at the seams with potential and was really well positioned. Either that or everybody just decided this is the weekend for Dimir Midrange. So be ready for this deck. It's certainly going to be all over the ladder as people climb back into Mythic with the start of this new season happening.
Tight margins. Tight margins indeed. And seeing the return in specifically of Tenacious Underdog to relevance, cards that we didn't call as relevant when they were released, such as Fairy Mastermind, and also the return of Kaito. So tight margins, I can definitely see the game plan. Talk to us about going low. What is the trend in going low? I know that just talked about it with Mono Black. Is this a good response for a control dominant meta? Is that precisely what happened? Why did these decks start to?
Yeah, so I think ultimately what this signifies is that Esper controls the top and Domain is starting to rise, and Dimir Midrange is perfectly positioned to combat both of those strategies, where it says, all right, we're going to be able to rip your hand apart, and we're also going to be able to counter the top end while applying some pressure at the low end. So this is just a classic tempo-based deck that snowballs its advantage and has a couple game-ending shut-the-door spells in the form of Shieldred. You know, as per usual, the 4-mana Shieldred just sits there and goes, you've got 2 turns. What are you going to do? And once you've ripped their hand apart and you have a couple make disappears sitting around / disdainful strokes, the answer is usually not very much, and that's where it just slams the door. So it's tempo, it's effective. Given where the meta is, I absolutely understand why this is rising in prominence.
Okay. All right. That that makes my questions a little bit more decisive or narrow, I want to say, for this next deck. Talk to us about 5-color domain. How has this deck seen a breakthrough, if at all?
Oh, domain. Okay. So it didn't take home trophies, but it did top 8 each of the MTGO challenges over the weekend, and giving it that really gave it the consistency it needed to merit inclusion at the top tier once more. Now, I could show you the lists that top 8'd, but frankly, they're pretty uninspired. They haven't really shifted, and I don't honestly agree with most of the card choices in them. Thus, I'm just going to give you an untested iteration based entirely on theory that if Domain diversifies its threat base instead of relying on 2 to 3 haymakers to stabilize, I think it'll have a strong chance against a meta filling up rapidly with counter spells and tempo. I mean, I don't see that a top end heavy build doing very well against Dimir Midrange. In fact, I see it getting pummeled by Dimir Midrange. But I look at a build like this, where you have Wedding Announcement to supplement your 3-drops, and you have Wandering Emperors so that you can play around some of the end of turn scenarios. You can actually play through it. I think it has more to it.
Yeah, I would concur, and I would also add, you don't have to build the Selesnya base like we have there. I call it the Selesnya base. It's what me and Dark have been testing and playing for a minute. We actually have a video of a showdown with it. I love that version of the deck, but there are Bant and Jund style bases that you can use that are also aggressive, and also use board wipes in the mid game to try to stabilize and take over the board. So yeah, talk to us about, of those bases, if you know exactly what I'm referring to, why you prefer this more or less Selesnya base.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this one's starting to push more towards Bant. We're not the whole Monty into it, but it's starting to. But you're right, it is essentially a Selesnya base. And if you look at it, it's not dissimilar from Orzhov Control in a lot of the slots. You have Ossification into Wedding Announcement, into Emperor, into Sunfall, and that is Orzhov Control straight through. The difference is you're trying to ramp a little bit faster than they are, and you're trying to go a little bit wider than they are. And last but not least, you get to play Leyline Binding on turn 2 sometimes, and usually by turn 3 or 4, it's able to flash out. That's a big deal right now. There aren't amazing answers for enchantments. Leyline Binding is still one of the most efficient removal spells sitting around, and that's the main reason to play Domain as a Trax on Leyline at this point. So if you don't think either of those spells are well positioned, then I don't think Domain's where you want to be. That's where you start moving into more of the Orzhov control lists, or maybe just a Bant control list, which I haven't seen anyone even try. But it depends. It depends where you're trying to position for the meta.
Yeah, that we answered the question I was going to ask in a more roundabout fashion. We got there. I was going to ask how something as narrow as Domain can win in a more mid tempo, not aggro, but more aggressive style meta. And the answer is that it has a strong base that actually creates a board state, competes with the opponent, puts pressure on them on the way to the top end cards. So I think that's really the answer in short.
Yeah, and I'll just add a piece there. If you watch the Pro Tour over this past weekend, you would have noticed the finals were Mono Green Tron versus Rakdos Scam, and that was essentially kind of like watching a Domain versus Dimir Midrange matchup, except in Modern. You know, you have a tempo-based deck, and you have a deck with inevitability that wants to ramp its mana very heavily, very quickly. And you start to see where the Mono Green Tron list was struggling in the finals, and yet it made it to the finals of that Pro Tour, and it placed 3 copies in the top 8. There are ways to mitigate that, and they did a really good job with how they designed that deck. So I would say start looking, honestly, you can cross-apply some of this theory from format to format. And I would look at some, like the Mono Green Tron deck, watch some of those matches in the top 8 and think to yourself, how were they able to pilot it through a field of faster decks? And do we have some of those same tools, maybe slower, worse versions, obviously, in Standard? And I think cards like Chrome Host Seed Shark really speak to me on that level, because it's a card that seems like an innocuous 2/4 creature, and yet it basically stabilizes the board on its own in many instances, especially against decks like Azorius Soldiers and Dimir, where they have like Fairy Masterminds, but you have a 2/4. They're not swinging through. So That's where I'm trying to get with this, is that it's got some interesting ways to combat it, but you have to really do some thinking about it. You can't just slam more haymakers in the sideboard, which people are still trying to do. They're still shoving T-Rexes into the sideboard like, this will solve it. Like, no, it won't. That thing's dying on impact. It's not going to work 99% of the time.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We've seen it many a time, the odd sideboard choices with Domain. Okay, let's move on to the final archetype of our Tier 1 analysis. And this one's a doozy. Selesnya Enchantress. Let's go.
I mean, honestly, who would have thought this little number would rise to prominence again? I didn't have it picked. I didn't have it picked to do anything else this season except sit in Tier 3 land. I mean, it's been a long time since we saw Selesnya Enchantress make waves, but it placed second in the first MTGO challenge while nabbing another top 8 the following day in the second MTGO challenge this past weekend. Farewell hasn't seen heavy play in a while, and I think that's part of what's leading to the spike in performance from ye olde Enchantress. But the fact that at any point Control could hate this archetype out of existence is extremely problematic, in my opinion. I don't expect this to be a mainstay of Tier 1, but it can spike a random weekend, and that makes sense given its power level. Like, this is a very strong deck. It just loses to this card called Farewell. So if Farewell's not around, this deck's possibly really well positioned. The moment you start seeing Farewells in high numbers, time to retire this deck. You know what I mean? And that's it. It's rough. It's rough.
I think it's safe to say this deck is riding the wave of decks that are starting to go lower in their gameplay and in their attack. And secondarily, I have a comment. I don't really have a question, but the Hallowed Haunting build, just continues to prove itself, right? Talk to us again about, remind the audience why we love the Hallowed Haunting build of this deck.
So personally, I love the Calyx build, but the Calyx build isn't as strong. the Hallowed Haunting build's stronger because it's difficult to hate out. There isn't good ways to interact with enchantments, especially with Invoke gone. So now you can play this Hallowed Haunting, and the moment it resolves, you know that basically every other card in your deck now also has a creature attached to it. So you're 2-for-1ing on everything else for the rest of the game, and that's very strong. And you're going to have it's army in a can, you know what I mean? And these cards that have Flashback and Disturb, the ability to get multiple triggers, Spirited Companion drawing you cards, you start to see how you just value, and you can grind out these tempo decks like Dimir Midrange, where they really, really struggle. They basically have to land a Shieldred and keep it in play, or else they're going to get run over by the advantage that you have, and you're just as low to the ground as they are. You're curving out at 4-2. They have Shelly, you got Hallowed Haunting. Let's battle.
Yeah, let us know what you think about our choices here in these Tier 1 archetypes in particular, because things have been shifting around a lot more than I think I could have predicted 9 weeks back during the bans. I thought maybe this was going to crystallize the meta, the way that certain decks got hated out, how mid-range really got hated out in a big way, but it has really done nothing but stir the pot. And so I'm here for it. Selesnya Enchantress, let's go. You're the underdog of the moment.
Fair.
We have time. Let's get to one of our favorite segments. I know my favorite segment. Let's get to the Brewer's Corner. And today we have a few good lists.
Oh yeah,
for your enjoyment.
So
what do we got here?
We start out with a list we found called Is It Control? And clearly it's going on. Chandra Hope's Beacon is still relevant. God damn it. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have Invoke, but we have all these other cards. We can double copy this big scores. And it's basically a Chrome Host Seed Shark deck that has Chandra at the top end with a Hullbreaker Horror. I don't know that I love all the choices made here, but I can see how this would be an interesting pick and could be worth tuning, frankly. Like, I'm not sure I understand why we need Tezzeret in this list, but
I think it interacts really well with Chrome Host Seed Shark, right? Because the incubate tokens.
Yeah, and I loved it when we had Reckoner Bankbuster. I like it a little less now, but you're right. With Chrome Host, it still has some nice synergy. And I don't know. Like, this is a list that intrigues me because it plays Hullbreaker Horror in the main. And I love it when we get to play that giant fucking Kraken Horror Shrimp and just launch it at people.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm in for it. Let's try it.
And Wizards be damned about the choice to only one planeswalker per set, because we still have some really powerful planeswalkers to play with right now, and people are forgetting about Chandra already.
They are. They are. The moment Invoke got banned, Chandra took a back burner seat, and I'm like, well, that feels weird. This card feels slept on again somehow. I don't know why, because
Yeah.
it's so powerful, but it just hasn't found the right shell yet. It might be one of those cards that's either broken or unplayable, but we'll find out as people keep tuning up different lists. In the meantime, I'm going to flip over to our second list here. Max,
Let's go.
Tell us all about this Golgari control list. I know this is after your own heart.
It's got some of my favorite cards, I'll tell you that. One being Glissa. Any chance to use Glissa is great. This card is overpowered. Anything with First Strike and Death Touch, overpowered. But then the ability to do something when you attack and put up a big threat. I love it. I'm going to talk to y'all about this Planeswalker Wren in the 3-drop slot. Another underused card. The +1 is awesome, keeps the aggression going. It really keeps your attack going. But if you can utilize the -2 in the right way, in the right list, and this might be the shell. I think Golgari might be the shell, so we'll see. Paired with Liliana, you're really working on resource management, taking away the opponent's attackers, and just popping out those 3/3 lands and constantly hitting. I love it. T-Dog's in here. It's really just a mixture of our favorite cards, right? Sheldred, Breach on the top end. Just throw in a little bit of everything. Big
Yeah.
Shelly included.
I mean, I love what this deck is trying to do in many ways, because it reminds me of the Rock, and I loved that Spiritmonger deck. You remember that way back
Oh
in
my
the
God,
day?
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I loved that deck, and this has some of those same vibes. So I really want to mess with it and just see if there's something to be had here, because I do think there's something to be said for taking that mono black shell, which this kind of does, and splashing another color, but instead of going into blue, I mean, green gives you the best, in my opinion, the best 3-drop in standard right now, which is Glissa, because Glissa
Absolutely.
it's a lightning rod. You have to answer it, or it will just start taking over the game with card advantage. And if they answer it, what I love is that it's positioned so perfectly to go, remove your threat, play a T-Dog, play a Glissa, play a Shieldred. And they're like, okay, so we have to kill Glissa and we have to kill Shieldred. We don't get to just ignore the 3-drop and out card advantage. No. You got to lightning rod them both, or you are going to get so far behind. So I love what it's trying to do.
Yeah, me too. I'm all for it. It's an underused archetype right now, and I don't understand why, because it does have some of the best cards in Magic that are just underused. I agree. We have one more, though. Go ahead. You were going to say something else.
Yeah, so this next deck was sent to us. A friend of the Rebellion messaged it on over and was like, you probably get emails like this all the time, but I've been working on this deck. I really want you guys to showcase it. So Eternal JDG, thank you for participating with the Rebellion. Thank you for shoving it our way so that we could show it to the world. I really think this is a cool list. I really appreciate people who reach out and want to be a part of this. We love it. We love it when people get involved with this. It's what we're all about. It's about community, people. So welcome to Zimone and Dinah Sultai.
And you picked my favorite color set, honestly, is Sultai. I haven't been able to play Sultai in Standard in ages.
Right?
So this intrigues me.
I mean, this is such a spicy list, because you get to play Zimone and Dinah, which I looked at. I remember looking at it and thinking, all right, if we can find ways to draw multiple cards a turn, this seems kind of busted if it sits around. Now, I'm not sure I agree with all of the choices here. I really want to, for instance, with Zimone and Dinah, I want to run Friction Arena. It just triggers it every turn automatically. I kind of want to run Fairy Mastermind, because we could still trigger it on our turn with that alone. And I'm very curious about running another Vraska over the next Tameo, because again, double triggers on Zimone. I want to abuse the hell out of Zimone, and I want to abuse the hell out of Shelly, and I want to play 4 copies of each of these and just go nuts. But you raised a good point. We were talking earlier, Max, about Kaido and Zimone. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, the Kaido tokens, I was specifically thinking about the 4-drop, because the Kaido tokens that you get from that, when they get removed, you get another further 2 drain. So removing those, sacrificing, that's 4 drain in 1 turn. I was also thinking about Teferi in the 5-drop slot as well, next to Tameo. Could work really well, creating tokens and drawing extra cards. So There's a draw meta somewhere in this color set to be had. Dimir kind of touches on it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyway, Eternal JDG, thank you for sending us this list. I'm definitely going to mess with this. I've got some different pieces I want to just kind of try out with it. I love that you're trying different pieces here. I actually love in the sideboard, there's 2 Fade from History. And, you're thinking, what the hell is this card about? It's the green Farewell for the Selesnya Enchantress deck. Like, it's 4 mana, wipe your board, basically, against Selesnya Enchantress. And there's 2 of them in the sideboard. I had completely forgotten that card existed until this got sent to me, and I'm like, oh my god, that's so cool. So, thank you. That's all I can really say. Thank you. This is a cool list. I'm happy we got to do this on the Brewer's Corner.
All right, and that's our Brewer's Corner. Comment below if you have any questions about the metagame, about Brewer's Corner, or about anything we've discussed today. And while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, Darth Rictus, go ahead and give us your final thoughts. What are your predictions for the coming week? How is this meta going to shift?
Honestly, my prediction for the weekend is that Dimir Midrange rages unchecked unless Mono Black evolves to handle it. There is a minor chance that Enchantress plays a role here, but honestly, it still feels to me like a bit of a fluke that it made it back to tier 1, and I think it'll drop right back down. Max, what about you? What do you got for a prediction for the weekend?
I also similarly think that the meta kind of anchors or hinges on Dimir Midrange and its rise recently. If I'm looking at the forest rather than the individual trees, I see a trend towards more aggressive archetypes. Maybe not necessarily aggro, which is why Mono Red's not doing so great, but more efficient archetypes, cards that get you your value, don't cost a whole lot, and things that you can do in the early game to go ahead and mitigate your opponent. And I think this has come about because of having to play so many weeks in a row in a control dominant meta. I think that's made players, for 2 reasons. One, for flavor, individual flavor. I think, I hear the rumblings. They hate control dominated metas. People in our comments have been not too happy with the fact that it's been like that for a few weeks now. So I think players overall want to adjust, and I think naturally some evolution has taken place as well.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Absolutely. Well, either way, tune in next week to see if the predictions hold true. And from all of us at the Rebellion, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.